Hello and welcome to The Bradley Show. I'm Bradley and today we're going to be talking about Christmas. I used to hate Christmas. In many respects I still do. Of course, I almost always enjoy the occasion, but there often seems to be an unsettling hypocrisy that seems to intrude on my otherwise delightful process of unwrapping presents. Christmas is an occasion that seems riddled with religious nonsense, bullshit humanitarianism, dull consumerism, and labour exploitation. People will readily tell you what the true meaning of Christmas is, but what they often say seems to fundamentally contradict the festival itself. It's about Jesus, it's about peace on earth, goodwill, and the brotherhood of man. It's about giving, it's about consumerism. It's a pagan festival of revelry. Christmas is a festival that is fundamentally unable to know what it is. Christmas is a hodgepodge of competing and conflicting elements that never seem to gel, and any purism looks likely to appear as a kind of hypocritical denial. First off, let's face it, Christmas is not about Jesus. Of course, I get you, Christ, Mass. It's actually named after the dude. So how can Christmas not be about Jesus? The problem is that Christmas seems like a rebranding exercise that never fully worked. Christmas has been with us for millennia, and it still feels like a pagan festival with a story about the birth of Jesus tagged on. Christmas trees, Yule logs, presents, a massive feast. Maybe if you cut these things out and spent your day in a church praying to God, reading the Bible and watching nativity plays, then I might grant you that this is a festival about the birth of Jesus. But that is hardly how most people experience it. At best, Christmas is two festivals uncomfortably smushed together, one about the birth of Jesus and the other a pagan celebration of revelry, a massive feast to get you through the winter, and a story about a poor family looking for shelter. Unfortunately for the Jesus side of the equation, that story about the baby and the manger, the Immaculate Conception and the mass infant genocide doesn't do much when everything else seems to stimulate our base brain. People find it much easier to identify with the food, the lights, the decorations, the tinsel, and all the sensory delights than they do with the biblical story. That isn't to say that the story doesn't have some exciting bits, some interesting unexpected twists, or some excitement and anticipation. The problem is we've heard it all before. Moreover, the festival would hardly have the same kind of power if it didn't have a whole load of other things tagged on. Here I side with many Jehovah's Witnesses. If you really want to celebrate the life of Jesus, don't celebrate Christmas. Nor is Christmas about selfless giving, or goodwill, peace on earth, and the brotherhood of man. This Dickensian humanism equally reeks of denial. Christmas might involve giving, but it's hardly the altruistic, saintly type. Real existing Christmas is largely about reciprocal exchange. We spend most of our time trying to ensure that the presents we give are roughly equivalent to the value of the ones we receive. Of course, there is wriggle room, conventions that ensure that little Timmy doesn't have to slave away down in the mine to ensure that he has a reciprocal gift for his parents. Yet Christmas is largely an occasion where people give in proportion to what they expect to receive. If you were to suggest that families give away their worldly belongings to those in need and spend the day in an empty room eating dry crackers, you would probably be called a humbug. Christmas is not about giving, at least not that sort. That's why I can't really get behind the later Scrooge. Of course, his shift to charitable generosity is an obvious improvement on his old incarnation, but there is something that reeks of dishonesty. Christmas in actual practice is not about that kind of generosity. It is a festival of indulgence founded upon labour exploitation, and to embrace it in the name of offering a little back to those less fortunate seems fundamentally blind to context. Isn't this the problematic tendency within charitable acts and humanitarian goodwill generally? Charity and humanitarianism alone do little to illuminate the social structure that gives birth to the problems they try to alleviate. This is what is so nauseating about crude and sentimental do-gooders. In their desire to defend the most vulnerable, They often overlook the very causes of inequality. They ignore complex socio-dynamics that give birth to particular problems and go for easy, feel-good answers. The irony is that easy, feel-good answers are the easiest to corrupt. That is why it is often hard to trust a do-gooder. From Mother Teresa to Jimmy Savile, do-gooders are often a dubious bunch. Do-gooders offer a way to quell our guilt and unease at the sight of injustice without actually changing the order of things. The fact that they often cozy up to dubious politicians and violent dictators often reveal where their true allegiances lie. Furthermore, humanitarianism and charity are often the perfect PR stunt. They offer a patronising and degrading pity for the poor and a moral aggrandizing of the giver. They demoralise the weakest and empower the already powerful. They do almost nothing to redistribute power itself. It is no wonder that warmongers love humanitarianism and paedophiles love charity. That is why the idea that Christmas is about goodwill should be viewed with the utmost suspicion. It easily slides into a PR stunt that hides the evil that people do. In abandoning the idea that Christmas is about giving, it is tempting to vindicate the idea that the true meaning of Christmas is consumerism. Yet there is something about this claim that is morally hard to swallow. In reality, Christmas tends to amplify society's tendency to induce misery for the many. As children, we are often taught that our presents are made by little people in a faraway land. This is often true, but it isn't exactly the little people we imagined. Many Christmas presents will be the product of child labour, slavery, sweatshops and extreme exploitation. Even in the first world, Christmas seems to play into the harshest criticisms of consumer capitalism. Christmas is often the worst kind of consumer festival, one that induces the working class to work longer, poorly paid hours in order to indulge in a short stint of consumer gluttony. Not that gluttony is entirely a bad thing. I am not endorsing the austere moralist opposition to consumerism. A bit of indulgence is good for the soul. The problem with consumerism is not that it is too gluttonous and too materialistic, but that it is not gluttonous and materialistic enough. For the worker, every act of indulgence must be bought through hard labour. Every act of gluttony comes at a price. The noble character of gluttony is demeaned by its dependency on wage slavery. The entrepreneurs and industrialists must also limit themselves. All innovation and ambition must be curbed by the profit motive. The pleasures of use are made subservient to the imperatives of exchange, and what emerges under the guise of indulgence is the aesthetic imperative of self-denial. Individual and collective ambitions are lost in the dearth induced by work and profit. Aesthetically, the cultural elitist in me wouldn't mind so much if this were a consumer festival that induced us to buy cool-ass music and awesome experimental cinema that expanded our horizons. But there is something about the collaboration between marketing moguls and the institution of the family, with its uncritical valorization of childhood, that produces a vomit-inducing dreariness. That is why, whilst I might enjoy the opportunity to buy and receive nice things, I can't uncritically celebrate consumerism. Christmas often exacerbates the worst side of consumer capitalism. This, of course, leads us to a fourth potential meaning of Christmas, or more to the point, the Winter Solstice, the celebration that marks the shortest day and the longest night of the year. This is the pagan interpretation. I like many elements of this interpretation. I like the fact that they give us the best excuse to simply indulge in revelry and fun. I like the fact that they brighten up an otherwise dark and miserable winter. But I have little interest, apart from fleeting curiosity, in the pagan mythology of the Yuletide. Of course, I would be open to learning more about it, but this is not what motivates me or most other people when they want to have fun at Christmas. Maybe we should propose a different meaning of the Yuletide festival, a distinctively modern one, one that can be summed up by the incendiary motto, "Greed is good." Of course, I am aware that in saying this, I bring to mind the yuppie spirit of the 1980s, a soulless, solipsistic self-interest that wallows in short-term self-destructive impulses. Not all greed is good, but does that mean that greed is bad? Selfless asceticism is itself a source of multiple sins. It is often born out of a failure to truly care for the self and foster those indulgences that make life beautiful. The free market individualist Ayn Rand was herself alert to the dangers of altruism, especially the way it masks a snivelling self-hatred. She proposed instead an ethics of selfishness, which, as different as our resulting politics are, strike me as interesting and insightful. For her, altruism seemed to produce a perverse ethic of anything goes, an ethic deserving of the same criticism that was often directed at her, i.e. of offering a cold, empty nihilism.
Altruism declares that any action taken for the benefit of others is good, and any action taken for one's own benefit is evil. Thus, the beneficiary of the action is the only criterion of moral value, and so long as that beneficiary is anyone other than oneself, anything goes.
Rand saw in altruism the rejection of all substantive moral values, choosing instead to focus on the beneficiary of the action. The result was
appalling immorality, the chronic injustice, the grotesque double standards, the insoluble conflicts and contradictions that have characterized human relationships and human societies throughout history.
Yet she was also aware that not all selfishness is good. She warned against
the kind of Nietzschean egoists who, in fact, are the product of the altruist morality and represent the other side of the altruist coin. The men who believe that any action, regardless of its nature, is good if it is intended for one's own benefit, just as the satisfaction of the irrational desires of others is not a criterion of moral value, neither is the satisfaction of one's own irrational desires. Morality is not a contest of whims.
Isn't Walter White from the TV series Breaking Bad the perfect example of this kind of counterfeit individual? Walter White is a chemistry teacher who, after discovering he has cancer, turns to producing crystal meth under the pretense, at least, of providing for his family after he dies. He likes to think of himself as the ultimate individual, a free market entrepreneur who will not sacrifice himself or his vision for anyone else. He almost seems like the perfect Randian, or, in her own language, objectivist hero. And yet, far from being too selfish, Walter White is not selfish enough. He hungers for the kick of adrenaline that comes from taking risks, outmanoeuvring his opponents, playing the bad boy in a similar way to how meth heads seek their fix. Walter White might look like the true individual, but his individualism is simply self-destruction that undermines everything and everyone he holds dear. Genuine self-interest is not diametrically opposed to the interest of others, just as the interests of others are often entangled in our own personal interests. This implies that not all self-interest is cold, cruel and solipsistic. For Ayn Rand, what was needed was a rational self-interest. Rational because not any self-interest would do. Self-interested because altruistic servitude does not realise man's natural aptitudes. In contrast, altruism tended to demoralise man. It
permits no concept of a self-respecting, self-supporting man, a man who supports his life by his own efforts and neither sacrifices himself or others. It means that altruism permits no view of man except as sacrificial animal and profiteers on sacrifice, as victims and parasites, and it permits no concept of a benevolent coexistence among men. It permits no concept of justice.
As strange as this may sound, in seeking to overcome the interplay between victims and parasites, Ayn Rand comes close to Karl Marx, for whom the interplay was to be found between the bourgeoisie, who fed off the living labour power of the proletariat, and the proletariat, who were dependent for their survival on the wages of the bourgeoisie. each found themselves dependent on the other and encumbered by each other. Through the creation of a new economic system, the communists of the 19th century sought to free mankind from this mutual enslavement. Isn't this what is so admirable about modernism in both its capitalist and communist forms? It sought to go beyond the crude Christian ethic of altruism and instead build towards a society of mutual self-interest, abandoning the crude moralism that kept mankind under the cosh of servitude and self-denial. This takes us back to greed, a word that would seem to evoke a kind of self-interested indulgence. If one part of the modernist project was that of overcoming Christian moralism that required us to slavishly live for others, the other part was the promise of material plenty. They no longer looked to the hereafter for our salvation. Instead, salvation was to be found in technological industriousness. Capitalists, communists and anarchists alike promised a world of earthly abundance. Peter Kropotkin talked of a need for luxury. Sylvia Pankhurst sought an economic system where all would satisfy their needs without stint or measure, producing a world beyond rationing and limiting of consumption. And the Paris Commune called for the inauguration of luxury of the whole community and the splendour of the future and the universal republic. Yet the luxury imagined by Kropotkin, Pankhurst and the Communards was not the luxury of the few, but a luxury for all, a world of communal luxury. This takes us back to Christmas. Christmas at its best ignites a communal spirit, grounded in mutual self-interest and the indulgence of earthly plenty. It is in this respect, and not out of altruistic goodwill, that it approaches the brotherhood of man. For all the exploitation, hypocrisy, stresses and strains, Christmas glimmers with a utopian potency. To adapt Marx's comments on religion, Christmas is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. Here we discover the proper religious dimension of Christmas. It offers a momentary cessation of toil and misery, and in its place provides a temporary heaven on earth. Christmas, in providing temporary happiness, illuminates the nature of real happiness, a cipher for the earthly dreams of the indulgence and self-interest of all. Thank you for watching. This has been The Bradley Show. See you soon. Good.